Welcome to WireWheel's Privacy Roll-Up, a weekly recap of top news in privacy from our CPO, Rick Buck. How's it going today, Rick?
Great, Janine. How's it going with you today?
Going well, going well. A lot of stuff happening as it is, usually week to week. But one of the things that I see is that the ULC voted to approve the Uniform Personal Data Protection Act. Can you tell us what this means and how it's impacting the world of privacy?
Yeah, thanks for bringing this one up. So the Uniform Law Commission, the ULC, is a nonpartisan group. They introduce nonpartisan legislation for states to use as models for legislation for their respective state. And the way that their approach is that it helps the states with the unified framework, but two, that it helps on a federal level to keep things consistent between the states and the federal government. This past week, they announced the Uniform Personal Data Protection Act. I don't know if people are calling it the UPDA or just UPDPA. Somebody's going to say it correctly, but the UPDPA looks a lot like some of the state laws that we have out there now. It governs how businesses collect and control personal and sensitive data. And personal and sensitive data are defined and defined as you might expect them to be defined.
Right.
Interestingly, the bill, the model that this bill takes on appears to be a little more narrow than, say, California or Virginia. So, for example, while the bill has rights, it has fewer rights. It does have a right to copy or correct your personal data, but it doesn't have a right to delete your data. It doesn't have a right to portability, and it doesn't have a private cause of action. So that could be kind of interesting. It does look familiar in some ways to the other state laws in that it applies to controllers or processors that conduct business in the state that adopts this. It produces products or services directed at people in that state. And then again, it has things like that during a calendar year, you maintain personal data of more than 50,000 data subjects. So they're not talking about monetary value there, but just that you have the number of people. And or that you earn more than 50% of your gross revenue from maintaining the data of personal information from subjects. So again, no monetary association. Well, monetary association in this case, but interesting the way they're approaching that. There's exemptions for state agencies or political subdivisions. There's exemptions for publicly available information. There are a number of other exemptions that'll be spelled out in that in the model. They have an interesting approach, which is on defining different levels of data practices. And they talk about a couple different levels. One, a compatible data practice. Number two, an incompatible data practice. And number three, a prohibited data practice. And in each category or subcategory, I should say, they have different mandates about the types of consent that are required or not required. So, for example, in a compatible data practice, you don't need consent to process people's personal information. In an incompatible data practice, and that would typically be things around processing high risk or sensitive data, affirmative consent would need to be collected to process the data. And then, of course, in prohibitive data practices would be categories that would be illegal for you to actually to carry out that business function. So, that's the long and the short of it. We could go into great detail about all the nitty gritty of it. On one hand, I think it's an interesting model. It makes it a little bit easier for states to think about how to stand up a privacy law. We've seen a lot of states stand them up. We've seen a lot of states have their bills die on the floor. Will this stimulate more states to introduce legislation? We'll see. Final amendments still need to be made to this. If it actually comes to light, it'll be introduced in state legislators a year from January, so January 22, and then look to see states potentially use this as the Lego board, as the model language for their independent state legislation. So again, more energy on legislation. This time it's at the state level. It'll be interesting to see how this influences other states and how those other states influence potential federal legislation.
It definitely will. And like we talk, and I probably say this each episode, more and more, I'm hearing more and more activity kind of or seeing more and more activity at the federal level, the more the activity increases at the state level, and more states, especially around Colorado, which is the last that we saw to pass that legislation. So I would say the next 12 to 18 months are going to be very, very interesting.
Absolutely. A lot to keep an eye on.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So another extremely interesting topic. It sounded like there was the introduction of the SAFE Act, and it was introduced by Roger Wick, who is a Republican from Mississippi and ranking member of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. And the other member that actually introduced as well was Marsha Blackburn, Republican from Tennessee, and a ranking member of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection, Product Safety, and Data Security. So after saying all of that, in terms of the SAFE Act that's been introduced, what is this legislation designed to actually do?
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up. And I think it's a perfect dovetail into where we left off. So number one, we're seeing a proliferation of state energy, and now maybe a model for future state legislation. One of my closing comments in our last question was, how will that influence federal legislation? As we've discussed before, I think, is it going to happen in 21? Doubt it. Is it going to happen in 22? Maybe. But I think the atmosphere and the appetite for federal legislation here in the United States around privacy is increasing. And to your point, Senators Wicker and Senators Blackburn, both Republicans, have introduced the Safe Data Act. They join a couple of other senators who have introduced bipartisan acts. Senator Gillibrand introduced the Data Protection Act of 2021. Senators Klobuchar and Kennedy and Manchin and Burr reintroduced a bill called the Social Media Privacy Protection and Consumer Rights Act.
Wow.
So we're starting to see a lot more bills being introduced. The Safe Data Act, again, looks a lot like other bills. They all have their nuances and unique features. But the focus of it is to provide Americans with more choice and control over their data. And in doing so, it's putting more responsibility on businesses and granting more authority to the FTC. Right. So let's talk about that a little bit. Things that are familiar. It's going to require businesses to allow consumers to have rights to access, rights to correction, rights to deletions and portability. It's going to prohibit businesses from transferring data with sensitive data without consent. It's going to prohibit businesses from denying customers a level of service if they exercise their privacy rights. There's a data minimization consideration. There's a limitation on secondary uses. There is a concept about establishing uniform data protections to be enforced by the FTC and by state attorney generals. Interesting what some of the business requirements are going to be. It's going to also require businesses to be more transparent and accountable, things that we've seen in GDPR, things that we've seen in some of the other state laws. But a privacy policy, talking about what you do with data and how you collect data and what your rights are. Privacy impact assessments are going to be required for the processing of high risk or sensitive data.
Right.
Companies will be required to put controls and reporting structures in place to make sure that privacy risks are being assessed and remediated.
Right.
And then it'll prohibit any data processing in ways that would be inconsistent or in violation of any federal civil rights laws. So, looking a lot like GDPR or sounding a lot like GDPR,
Mhm.
and thinking about all the right things. It also puts additional influence and additional focus on strengthening the FTC's ability to respond to changes in technology and to hold businesses accountable for misusing their consumers' data. It's going to authorize the FTC to develop new rules and expand categories around, for example, sensitive data. It's going to require the FTC to share information with appropriate executive or state agencies if they have information that a business has processed or transferred consumer data in a way that violates any federal laws or anti-discrimination laws. It's going to require a data broker registry. So that corner of the industry is going to be interested in where this bill goes. And in general is going to expand the FTC's authority on being able to enforce data privacy and consumer rights. Is this going to be the winning horse? I don't know. Is there going to be a winning horse? We'll see. Is there even going to be a race? We'll see. But I think again, it's certainly no secret that my opinion is I think that we need a unified federal legislation to harmonize privacy laws that are going to one, not be friction points for businesses to run their businesses, but also going to empower consumers to better protect and control the way in which their data is being used. So more to come.
Well, I certainly from a marketing perspective, it's really an interesting play because a lot of the marketers that I speak with right now, we see all of this at the legislative level. We really kind of understand in terms of, compliance and security that these things are coming, but they have big implications all the way across an organization.
Right.
So, I want to just kind of thank you for digging in deep into this. And I also want to let everyone watching know that Rick produces a blog every week. So you can find the blog regarding these two topics and other topics in past episodes at WireWheel.io and, or reach out to us. So I want to thank you, Rick, for your time this week. And I want to thank all of our viewers for tuning in. And if you have any questions about privacy you'd like for us to answer, please just feel free to reach out to us again at marketing@wirewheel.io. And you'll also be able to find this link in the description. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to WireWheel's YouTube channel. And again, thank you for your time today to all of our viewers. And thank you, Rick. I appreciate it.
Janine, as always, it's a pleasure to do this with you. And to anybody who's watching, thanks so much for your interest. We'll see you again next week.
Thank you.